In the fading heat of a Texas autumn, the town of Dry Creek bustled with the final livestock auction of the season. The sun hung low, baking dust into the splintered bones of wooden buildings and stirring fleas above tired cattle. In the midst of it all, a man stood apart, Cal Whitaker, a reclusive rancher known more for his slunts than his words and more for his isolation than any warmth he extended to others. He had come into town for a horse. What he found instead was a girl tied to a rope like a beast of burden. She was perhaps 19, barefoot and dust-caked, her face hidden beneath matted hair. She stood just outside the corral, silent and still beside a swaying man with a bottle in one hand and a rope in the other. Her name was not spoken. Her voice had never been heard. But her eyes they searched, locked and held. And when they met Cal's, something passed between them not even language could hold. The drunk Roy Danner hollered to the crowd, calling her a dumb one, offering her as part of a package deal with the trembling bay mare. Men laughed. One spat. Cal turned away. He wasn't here for trouble. And he certainly wasn't here to buy a girl, but her gaze, still unwavering, remained on him. Not pleading, not begging, just seeing. There was something familiar in that, something unspoken. Cal knew loneliness, and he knew what it looked like when someone else wore it too. He bought them both, as jeers floated through the hot air. You buying livestock or starting a harem? Whitaker, he led the mare away, the girl following without question, bare feet padding behind him like a shadow. She never spoke, not when he untied the rope, not when he motioned for her to climb into the wagon, not even when she brushed his coat with her fingers, a single tentative gesture. A thank you, no, something deeper. She had chosen in that moment to trust him. Her name, he would learn later, was Mara. She did not cry. She did not ask where they were going, and when the wagon rattled out of town and into the hills, neither of them looked back. There was nothing for either of them behind them anymore. What makes this introduction resonate is not action but absence, not the noise of conflict, but the profound stillness of connection. It is a love story that doesn't begin with passion, but with mercy. Cal didn't save Mara because he wanted her. He saved her because on some unspoken level he recognized her pain, and perhaps hoped she might recognize his in return. When they arrived at his ranch, a weather-worn stretch of land hugged by cottonwoods and quiet, she stepped down lightly. She looked at the world like it was a stranger. She did not ask permission to belong nor expect kindness. But inside, beside a warm stove and a tin cup of coffee, she found something that felt a little like peace. And so did Cal. The story begins not with fire, but with silence. And in that silence, a question begins to stir, one neither of them can yet ask out loud. Can two broken people who speak no shared language still find a way to hear each other's hearts? The first days on the ranch were quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes when no one has anything to say, but the kind filled with things that cannot be spoken. Cal Whitaker had lived in silence for years. It suited him, this life of fences and fields, the creak of barnwood, the lowing of cattle. But with Mara, the silence changed shape. It wasn't emptiness anymore, it was charged with presence. She didn't fill the space with words, she filled it by simply being. Mara moved through the cabin like someone afraid to be seen but unwilling to disappear completely. Each morning, Cal left out a cup of black coffee and a plate of beans on the hearth, unsure if she'd eat. At first, she didn't. But then the cup was empty one morning, and the next the beans were gone too. She swept the porch. She folded her blanket. She watched the sky. She never asked permission, never waited for instruction. The first time she used the chalk, it was with a tentative hand. Cal had placed it by the windowsill beside a cedar board. He tapped the board after supper and said, "Name slow and low." She didn't answer with sound. She crouched the hem of her dress, brushing the floor, and wrote a single word in soft, slanted letters: Mara. Cal repeated it, tasting the name like it had weight. She turned without expression and walked into the darkened barn. In the days that followed, Mara began to move through the routines of ranch life with uncanny intuition. She gathered eggs, boiled water, fed the dogs. She never fumbled or second-guessed. Cal didn't know how she knew what to do, whether she had done these things before or whether she simply observed and understood faster than most, but she did them with precision and silence. Then came the storm. It had begun like any other late-season squall in Texas, sneaky slow. The air grew heavy, but there was no thunder, no warning in the sky that Cal could see. He had been in the cattle shed tending to a sick calf when Mara burst in barefoot, her eyes wide and breath short. She didn't scream, didn't wave. She simply grabbed his coat sleeve and pulled hard. What he asked, startled. She pointed upward, her hands shaking, eyes locked on the rafters. Cal frowned, half turning back to the calf. But there was something in her gaze, urgent, anchored, that forced him to move. She pulled again, this time toward the barn doors. Seconds later it happened. A crack of lightning split the air like a curse. The old pecan tree behind the cattle shed exploded into fire and fell with a roar that shook the ground. Sparks rained down. Smoke curled. The roof trembled. The blast sent Cal stumbling. The calves cried out. For a moment, time fractured into light and heat. When he turned, Mara stood just outside the threshold, face lit by flame, unmoving. Her chest rose fast, but her eyes were steady. She had known, not guessed, known. Later that night, after the flames were extinguished and the animals calmed, Cal sat across from her at the kitchen table. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. There was no chalk between them, no gestures, no questions. Only wood under their hands and something invisible hanging in the space, something that said, "You saw it coming." She had heard something he had missed. Not thunder, not wind, something older, quieter. That was the moment Cal stopped thinking of Mara as a burden he had taken in out of pity. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't broken. She was something different, something attuned, and he wasn't sure what to do with that. In the days after the storm, Cal began to notice the way she moved with animals. She didn't command them. She didn't coax them. She simply stood still long enough for them to come. The injured mare she'd come with, the same one they'd bought together, hadn't eaten in days. Cal had been preparing to put her down. But Mara sat beside her in the stall, brushing her flank in slow, rhythmic strokes. Not talking. Not even signing, just listening with her hands, with her breath, with her stillness. The mare began to eat again. That day Cal gave her a chore he hadn't planned, mucking the stalls, a rough job. She didn't flinch. She did it cleanly, quietly. And that night, as always, she left a note on the board. Dog limping. Bacon low. Wind smells sharp. He stared at the last line. Wind smells sharp. He went outside, stood on the porch, and breathed. And sure enough, it did. Like copper and ash. Like something that hadn't arrived yet, but would. For a man like Cal, trust was never handed over. It was built slowly, piece by piece, but with Mara it hadn't needed words. He found himself watching her more, not with suspicion, but with something like reverence. How did she know what she knew? How did she seem to read the world like a map where others only saw dust and sky? There were nights when he would catch her standing outside the barn, face tilted toward the horizon, eyes clouded, listening. And in those moments he felt something stir in his chest, a sound not made by voice or wind, but by recognition. He realized he didn't want to go back to the way things were. She never asked for space, but he gave her the spare room off the kitchen. She never sought comfort, but she folded his clothes when she found them draped over a chair. She never touched him until one morning as he passed her in the hallway, she brushed his arm lightly with her fingers. It lasted no more than a second. But in that second something rooted. She had not spoken, had not smiled. But he knew deep in the scarred, quiet places of himself she trusted him, not because he saved her, but because he saw her, and because in her silence she saw him too. The days after the storm brought with them a strange stillness, not the soft kind that settles over the prairie after a good rain, but the heavy kind that signals something's brewing just out of sight. Mara had saved Cal's life and perhaps even the lives of the animals that night by sensing the storm before it struck. And yet out in the town of Elkhorn Bend, that miracle was not viewed with awe. It was met instead with the same suspicion that small minds often offer to what they cannot name. It began with a whisper, a passing comment tossed like an old nail into a bucket meant to clang. The blacksmith's wife had said it first while folding linens under her porch. She stares too long at the cattle, like she knows which one's gonna fall before it does. The voice was low but not soft, sharp like cold iron. It spread like prairie fire. At the general store, someone muttered that Mara walked through the fields at dawn, barefoot, like she was listening to the earth. One boy said his mother wouldn't let him near the ranch no more. She touched our goat, he whispered, and it gave birth too early. That ain't natural. And the preacher's son, a sallow boy who rarely looked anyone in the eye, nodded as if it confirmed what he'd already known. They didn't know Mara, but that didn't stop them from deciding who she was. Cal had seen it happen before. After the war, after land changed hands and names were taken off deeds like peeling paint. Good people had been turned to threats with no more than a sentence and a few scared glances. And so when he rode into town one morning for feed, he could feel the looks, not curious, not kind. Tight like ropes around a rumor. He didn't tell Mara. He didn't want to burden her with the ugliness of it. But he should have known better. She always knew. It came to a head 3 days later. A group of 8 people stood at the edge of Cal's fence line just before dusk, boots kicking up dust like warnings. They didn't bring guns, but they brought torches unlit but held upright, like symbols, like intentions waiting for permission. Cal stepped out of the barn, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Jaw set hard. He'd seen the look in their eyes before, not rage, not even hatred. Something worse, certainty. The kind of certainty that turns neighbors into judges. Earl Beckett, a cattleman with bad knees and a bitter heart, stepped forward. His voice was low and graveled. "We want her gone, Cal." Cal said nothing. "She hears things," Earl continued, glancing toward the cabin where Mara watched through the window curtain. "Things she shouldn't." "She's mute," Cal replied. "That ain't the same as deaf," Earl snapped. "She sees before the sky shifts, talks to animals like they talk back. One of my steers dropped dead last week. She was the only one who touched it." "You think she cursed it?" Cal asked, incredulous. "I think she's cursed, period." A murmur rippled through the others. Some looked away. Others nodded slowly, their fear turning to collective bravery in the presence of their own noise. One woman spat near her boots. Another crossed herself. Inside the house, Mara hadn't moved. She stood straight, shoulders slightly back. Her hands were steady, but her lips pressed tight. She had seen faces like these before, not twisted by anger that she could understand. These were twisted by belief, and belief was far harder to reason with. Cal stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. His voice was quiet, firm. "She saved a child's life, a ranch hand's boy. Came down with a fever that near killed him. The doc was gone. She brewed herbs, wrapped his chest, held his hand, till he breathed clean again. Maybe she gave him the fever in the first place," a woman said. Arms crossed. "Witches used to heal too. That's what makes him dangerous." Cal didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. She is the only person I know who listens. The words hung in the air like smoke. He took another step. Not just with ears, with her hands, with her breath, with her whole damn soul. I've lived 35 years and I can count on one hand the people who've ever truly heard me, not just the words I said, but the silences I carried. And she did. Without saying a single thing, no one responded. You want to drive her off because she's different, because she sees the world in a way that makes you uncomfortable, because she reminds you of things you're too afraid to feel. He let the words settle. Fine, but you'll have to go through me. Earl's mouth twitched. He looked at the others, but no one moved. One by one they turned. Walked back through the dusk, torches unlit, boots heavy, heads lowered not in shame but in frustration. That night the ranch was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of dread. It was the silence of something having been tested and held firm. Mara brewed cider and placed the pot beside the fire. She didn't speak, didn't write, didn't sign. But after a moment she sat beside Cal at the kitchen table. She reached out her fingers, finding the back of his hand. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Her touch said, "What words couldn't I saw what you did? I know what it cost, and I am here." He turned his palm over, closed his fingers gently around hers. Outside the wind stirred the trees, but inside the log cabin something deeper settled. Not comfort, not safety, something more enduring: trust. After the dust settled from the confrontation, the world did not go back to what it was. Not for Cal Whitaker, and certainly not for Mara. Something had shifted. Not loud or dramatic, but deep and slow, like roots stretching under hardened earth. The quiet between them was no longer a wall. It had become something soft, something living. They had stood together against fear, and now what remained was the slow, steady work of becoming something new. It began with the simplest things. Each morning, Mara brewed coffee before the sky turned fully gray, moving about the kitchen like she had lived there her whole life. Cal taught her to ride slowly with caution, knowing full well the danger horses could pose to someone unfamiliar. She had never sat a saddle before, and the first time she did, her hands clung to the horn so tightly her knuckles turned white. But Cal didn't rush her. He walked beside the horse, his voice low and calm, not because she could hear, but because something in him needed to say the words anyway. He taught her by feel, how to sense a horse's shift in weight, how to press with your knees, not pull with the reins. Mara listened with her body, and slowly she began to ride. She moved with the mare like music, no sudden jerks, no harsh grips. Just rhythm, breath, and balance. She learned to trust the animal, and it trusted her back. In turn, Mara taught Cal a different kind of language, one made of hands and gestures and glances. It started at the kitchen table. She would spell out simple words: water, fire, thank you. Her fingers moved like leaves in a breeze, fluid, precise. Cal fumbled at first, his large hands clumsy, uncertain. But she never laughed. Instead, she would reach out gently, guiding his hands into the right shape. Her touch steady, patient. Slowly his fingers learned to speak, and the more they shared, the more the silence between them became a comfort. Not a lack, but a language of its own. Glances over the dinner table, a soft brush of fingers when passing tools. The way Mara's hand would rest lightly on Cal's back when she walked past him, like a reminder: I'm here. I see you. I choose this. But the transformation wasn't just between the two of them. Something in the town began to shift, too. It started as real change often does with the children. They came first, 2 boys from a ranch down the road. They wandered up to the fence one morning, curious about the girl who whispers to horses without words. Mara met them at the gate. She didn't ask questions. She simply opened her hand and invited them in. They followed her into the stable where she showed them how to brush a skittish foal without startling it. She didn't give directions. She just demonstrated slow movements, gentle hands, steady breath. And they copied her. They learned. Not just how to care for animals, but how to listen. How to be present. Word spread. Soon more children came. Some from town, some from farther off. Girls with braids and questions, boys with torn hats and eyes full of wonder. They sat with Mara in the garden as she dug roots or sorted herbs. They watched how she moved through the world, slow, deliberate, observant, and they mimicked her without realizing they were doing it. Cal watched it all unfold with a kind of quiet awe. He had spent most of his life believing that healing came from distance, from keeping your pain close but your people far. But now he saw something different. He saw how Mara's presence, her stillness, invited others to soften, to listen not just with their ears, but with their whole being. Even the adults began to shift. One gray morning, Nate Granger, the same ranch hand who'd once kept his distance, showed up at the gate with his arm in a sling. "Doctor's out east," he muttered, eyes lowered. "Heard she might fix things." Mara didn't say a word. She led him to the porch, motioned for him to sit, and gently examined the wound. Her brow furrowed. Her fingers moved with practiced ease. She bound the shoulder tight and applied a salve made from pine resin and mint. Nate winced, then sighed. "Feels better already," he whispered, not to her, but to the air. He left without another word, but 2 days later his wife brought a basket of eggs and left it by the gate. Then came the widow, Mrs. Fallon, the same woman who had once pulled her child away in fear. She came not for healing, but for peace. She hadn't slept in weeks, grief clawing at her chest. Mara sat with her as the sun set, her hands resting gently on the widow's shoulders. She said nothing, did nothing, just stayed. And by morning, something in the widow had quieted. She returned the next day with a scarf hand-knit, soft and gray, and placed it in Mara's hands. "For the girl," she said, "the one who hears more than we do." By then the town no longer called her strange. Some still didn't understand her and maybe never would. But more and more they stopped trying to explain her. They simply let her be. And Mara bloomed. She smiled more. She moved with ease through the land, teaching without teaching. Her hands, once curled tight in fear, now moved freely, openly, sharing all that she had learned from a world that never needed sound to speak. And Cal, for his part, had never felt so seen. He began to count time differently, not in months or years, but in the rhythm of mornings shared and evenings passed in quiet companionship. They built a small addition off the cabin, not a second bedroom, but a room of their own, lined with books they could not read aloud but still touched, as if the pages held breath. In that space they made meals, shared glances, laughed without sound. Their transformation was not loud, it was not grand, it was real. It was two people who had once lived in silence, not by choice, but by survival, finding in each other not just comfort, but voice. And in doing so, they taught the town a lesson far greater than any sermon or speech. They taught them that healing does not come when wounds are shouted over. It comes when someone kneels beside you in the quiet places, a hand over your heart, and says without saying a word, "I hear you." Winter lingered longer that year. The wind came not with rage but with memory, brushing against the wooden planks of the house like it was trying to remember the names once whispered in its walls. But inside warmth lived not just from the hearth fire, but from the rhythm of a life that had grown between two people without needing noise to take root. Cal Whitaker moved a little slower now. His knees ached when he rose before dawn, and his hands, once strong enough to break wild colts, trembled slightly when he poured Mara's tea. But she never mentioned it. She only met his gaze with that same stillness she had carried since the day he first saw her by the corral, a stillness that saw everything and judged nothing. Mara's hair had silvered soft strands braided back each morning with care. Her steps were careful but not uncertain. If anything, she walked now with even more intention, as if the earth beneath her feet had become more sacred with time, not less. She still tended the animals every morning, still ran her fingers along fence posts like reading the land's pulse, still brewed coffee before the sky turned gray and lined the chicken coop with pine needles before the first snow hit. But it was what she gave others that marked the quiet legacy she was building. Children came now, not just 2 or 3, but many. They arrived in the golden hush of early morning, their boots' muddy cheeks red from wind voices trailing off as they approached the ranch. Here they learned not with lessons but with presence. Mara didn't instruct, she invited. She showed them how to listen not with ears, but with heart. She'd sit with them by the herb patch, letting them run their fingers through lavender mint and wild chamomile. She taught them to sense the difference between a nervous rabbit and a calm one, just by the flick of its nose. She placed their small hands on a horse's flank, showing them how to breathe until the animal relaxed. Some of these children had never been heard at home. Not truly. Some talked too much and had been told to quiet down. Others talked too little and were called slow. But here with Mara, silence was not punishment. It was invitation. It was grace. Cal built a wooden bench beneath the cottonwood tree behind the house, not for show, but because it was where he and Mara always ended up as the sun dipped behind the hills. There they would sit shoulder to shoulder, 2 cups of tea balanced on a shared plank, their fingers sometimes touching, sometimes still. The view stretched out before them, amber fields, low hills, the occasional call of a hawk slicing the dusk. But neither of them watched it for beauty alone. They watched it because it was theirs. This was the life they had made together without ever needing to name it. Sometimes Cal would bring out his old harmonica, worn smooth from years, in his coat pocket, and play a tune that had no name. It wasn't always in key, and sometimes it trailed off mid-bar, but Mara would always close her eyes and sway gently as if she could feel each note in her bones. She could. Her hearing wasn't of the world's sounds, it was of its movements, its heartbeats, its unspoken truths. One evening, as the sun sank behind a curtain of wheat, Mara turned to him and did something rare. She spoke. Over the years, she had picked up bits of speech. Reading lips had come easier to her than expected. And with time and Cal's patience, she had learned to form words, to shape them gently with her breath. She didn't use them often. She preferred the quiet. But that evening, she looked at him, her eyes luminous in the fading light, and whispered, "I do not need sound. Only you." Cal blinked. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I hear you," he whispered. "Always have." They stayed like that until the sky turned purple and the wind stilled, as if the land itself had paused to listen. The next morning, a new group of children arrived, this time with parents in tow. A few townsfolk had begun to visit shyly at first, then with growing trust. Some brought preserves, others brought books. A few left small tokens, hand-knit scarves, jars of honey wildflowers tied with twine. Mara had started writing a message each day on the wooden slate nailed beside the front door. It had become her way of anchoring hope, of shaping the morning with intention. That day it read, "The day will be kind. I can feel it." No one asked how she knew. They just believed her. And then there came a winter unlike any they had known. A boy went missing in the snow, 7 years old, last seen chasing a dog beyond the tree line. Panic swept the town like wildfire. Men shouted. Mothers wept. Horses galloped in every direction, but it was Mara who changed everything. She stepped outside the cabin, knelt in the snow, and pressed her palms to the frozen ground. Her eyes closed, her body stilled. For a long moment there was no movement, only breath, only listening. Then she stood. She pointed west. Cal followed her without question. So did Nate Granger. So did half the town. 3 miles through pine, over ice-slick rocks and buried roots, they found the boy curled beneath a fallen log, shivering but alive. Mara ran, knelt, pressed her hand to his chest. The boy looked up and smiled weakly. No one ever doubted her again. From that day forward, no one called her deaf. They called her the one who listens, and in that simple name was all the reverence the world could give. Years passed. Cal and Mara aged not in loneliness but in rhythm. Their bodies slowed, but their bond deepened. They counted time not in birthdays or holidays, but in the way the wheat bent in late summer, the way a colt took its first steps under spring skies, the way Mara's fingers rested gently on Cal's when he no longer had the strength to hold tools. And when Mara's hands began to shake, when the arthritis stiffened her knuckles and her stitches grew uneven, Cal sat beside her by the fire and threaded needles for her in silence. They never called what they had marriage. There had been no papers, no witnesses, no white dress. But in every way that mattered, they had chosen each other every morning, every dusk, every breath between. Their love was not one of firecrackers or shouted vows. It was a love of soft wool and wild herbs, of porch benches and chalkboard messages, of slow glances and hands resting quietly on a heartbeat. A love that healed what the world broke. And when people spoke of them long after the cottonwood tree had gone bare and the barn had faded gray with age, they did not say, "That was a strange story." They said that was a good one. A story not of miracles or fame, but of truth. And the truth was this: a lonely man and a girl the world had thrown away had found in each other not just love, but listening. The kind that doesn't need words, the kind that endures, a kind of love that never has to shout because it already knows it's been heard. Out in the wide open plains of Texas, where silence stretches further than fences and the sky holds more memory than time, a man and a woman taught each other a new way of living. Not through speeches or grand gestures, not with expectations or declarations, but through a shared stillness, a sacred space where grief could rest and healing could begin. Cal Whitaker had lived most of his life in the echo of loneliness. He had grown used to the hush of early mornings and the aching quiet of nights, with no one to speak to. The ranch had been his world, its routine his refuge. But when Mara entered his life, a girl sold like livestock and branded by the silence others mistook as absence, the quiet around him changed. It became something alive. Not an emptiness, but a kind of listening. She did not need to speak to be heard. She did not need to hear in order to understand. In her silence there was deep attention. In her stillness there was power. With each sunrise, with each shared glance across the firelight, Cal came to understand that Mara had never lacked a voice. The world had simply never learned how to listen. Together they redefined what it meant to love. Not the love found in romance novels or shouted across crowded rooms, but the kind born in the pause between breaths, the kind forged in tending to wounded animals, reading storms in the air, and brewing coffee before the sky turned gray. A love built not on promises but on presence. And the land is old and scarred as the people who walked it listened too. Slowly, the community that once feared what they could not explain began to soften. The children came first, drawn by something they didn't yet know how to name. Then the townsfolk, one by one, the weary, the wounded, the curious, all came to see what it meant to be heard without judgment. By the time their hair had grayed and their steps had slowed, Cal and Mara had become something more than just a couple who lived out past the ridge. They became a story, a living memory, a quiet legend of how gentleness can change a heart and how listening, true listening, can save a soul. They didn't leave behind monuments or letters or sermons. They left behind the echo of a truth as old as the hills themselves, that love does not always roar. Sometimes it simply sits beside you, holds your hand and listens. And sometimes that is enough. So if you find yourself wandering, tired, unheard, aching for something you can't yet name, remember the ranch with the cottonwood bench, the girl who listened with her hands, and the man who finally understood what it meant to be truly heard. Out there in the quiet, they're still walking side by side, and they always will be. The story of Cal and Mara reminds us that true connection doesn't require grand words or perfect speech. It requires presence, patience, and the courage to listen with the heart. In a world that often values noise over nuance, this tale offers a counterpoint that healing can be found in silence and love can be spoken through gesture, care, and trust. Mara, a girl discarded by the world, shows that being different is not a weakness but a strength when embraced with compassion. Cal, a man hardened by years of loneliness, teaches us that redemption is possible not by erasing the past but by choosing gentleness in the present. Their bond shows that when we stop demanding explanations and start simply being there for one another, something beautiful grows. Whether in a relationship, friendship, or community, the greatest gift we can offer is to truly listen, not just to words, but to what lives underneath them. Fear, hope, longing, love. And sometimes the most powerful statement we can make is a hand, reaching for another, saying without sound, I see you, I hear you, and I'm staying. That perhaps is the deepest kind of love there is. If stories like this speak to something quiet inside you, if you believe that love doesn't have to be loud to be real, that healing takes time, and that listening with the heart might just change everything, then this is your place. Welcome to Frontier Reverie, where we remember the ones history tried to forget, where silence holds meaning and every tale carries a heartbeat. Subscribe to walk with us through the dust, the dusk, and the unspoken. There's more ahead, more courage, more redemption, more love that lingers long after the last word fades. Because out here we don't just tell stories, we listen.